What's going on, everybody? William Spencer here with another fun podcast. This one's going to be a little bit different. Why? Well, one, because I don't have coffee in my cup. Thank you, Brad. I've got tea. I've got tea in my cup. But this particular conversation, I think, is going to be really interesting because we're not diving into the individual. We're diving into a story. Brad, you've got a story, and I want to introduce you, but I feel like you can honestly introduce yourself. So by all means.
Sure. Well, my name is Brad Barnes. I'm from Rome, Georgia. You might have seen me on my run for the second vice chairmanship of the state party recently, or possibly last cycle when I ran for state house. The story we're here to talk about today is something that everyone in the state of Georgia and throughout the country should be interested in, because it's at the intersection of so many of today's issues. The weaponization of law enforcement, whether our Constitution will hold up against the Marxist insurgency surging across our country, and the trans queer movement that seems to be irresistibly targeting children throughout our country, introducing gender confusion. So, with that said, if you want to get into the details of it,
yeah, Brad. While I talk, go ahead and adjust your mic a little bit there, man, if you need to. What we're diving into here is culture. This is culture. This is law. These are fairly controversial subjects. But I'll tell you, Brad, I think one of the most important things we do as conservatives should be to tell stories. We should be able to tell stories, to folks so that they understand the individual experiences that we have maneuvering through culture. This particular culture that we're in, because politics doesn't necessarily just exist within the legislative. I mean, the important parts, of course, do. But on the grassroots level, we're dealing with some pretty crazy stuff. And I think your story encapsulates some of that crazy. So by all means, wherever you want to start, give me a little bit about kind of how things started.
Sure. You're absolutely right. Politics is all downstream from culture. And if you lose control of the culture, you lose control of politics and you lose control of your country. That's why, people that dismiss the culture war are really not understanding the proper role that the culture plays. The Constitution is a framework for a moral people. And without Christianity doing the heavy lifting, you've got basically the husk of a society left, right? But the story, that we're about to talk about centers around Rome's second annual Trans Queer Pride for Kids event. And Rome, Georgia is a small Appalachian town. It's known probably for most of the country as Marjorie Taylor Greeneville. It's the home base of Marjorie Taylor Greene. It's a 70% Trump County, Floyd County. So a fairly conservative area to be having such an event, right? And this is our second one. We and a group of us protested it last year. You had things like middle-aged men, doing sexualized dances for children, getting tipped by children as if they're strippers at the event last year. You had sex toys being sold in a public park in such a town at the eye level of children. Females walking around bare-breasted at this park. All kinds of stuff that really shouldn't have been going on in the audience of children. If you have an event centered around sexuality, it's not appropriate for children, right? And so we're going to protest it this year, and ran into a lot of problems. We ended up with 2 protesters and 2 citizen journalists arrested that day, and a lot of violations of the Constitution that day. So the first protest of the day was organized by Reverend Goggins, who's a local minister. And from the get-go, his rights were violated. They were going to do the right thing and get a permit with Rome City, because Rome City has an incredibly stringent and actually unconstitutional assembly permit process, assembly ordinance. And they had put in a request to protest, to hold signs at the event itself along the levee in Rome. So levee is Rome has a levee system that surrounds its downtown because it has 3 rivers. It's known as a river city, and there's a walking trail along that levee. Well, we protested there last year, no permit, no problem. This year, they put in to have a permit there because they were going to do the right thing. Instead of setting them up there, the police, and where they would have been fine, the police moved them across the river to the other end of downtown, which was the staging location for the Pride Parade. Well, once that parade went past, 5 minutes later, their protest was null and void. They were just kind of in no man's land. And they did that under time, place, and manner restrictions. And the problem with that is federal jurisprudence does not allow you to just willy-nilly modify someone's permit for assembly like that. The time, place, and manner restrictions are merely the minimum necessary to protect public safety and to have crowd control. And that could have easily been accommodated on location with some temporary fencing, which the police department has ready access to, and then that would have been fine.
I've got a question, Brad. I've been to a couple here and there protests. Protests aren't typically my thing, right? I'm not. Actually. Yeah, but at the same time, the protests that I have been to, the few that I have been to, I went to like a pro-life one, for example. The police typically do a very good job at saying, okay, you guys just stay over here. We're going to set up things to accommodate that. You guys stay over here. We're going to set up things to accommodate that. From what it sounds like to me, from the perspective of the police force, they were probably like, honestly, we just don't want to deal with this. This is going to be a fiasco and we don't want to deal with it. And, given that thought process, which I could honestly empathize with, but given that thought process, at what point does that kind of infringe on the ability of free speech and things of that nature? Is that what you're kind of tackling here?
So, there's some background there. The police, highest ranking police officer handling the events of the day is apparently very in favor of this event. He said he talks to the trans queer pride organizers every week, and he has done so for a year. Finds them to be super reasonable. These are people that are grooming children, actually. And, we had a meeting with police leadership, a couple of us that ended up being at this protest about a month and a half before it happened, to address the problems with last year's event, right? And, because they had public indecency going on. They had a lot of stuff around minors that was illegal. Actually, tipping dancers in the city of Rome is illegal. So, they were letting all these law violations go, unaddressed because they don't want to, do anything to push back against the left, right? Because the left makes that painful for anybody. And they basically said, oh, we need to look to the future, don't look to the past, where we were not doing our job. And anyway, it was your fault that we didn't enforce the law, because you should have called 911 for every instance, even though the park was full of our police officers. And another wrinkle to all this is that the police department is on the payroll of Trans Queer Pride. So they're providing private security to the event, thousands and thousands of dollars. So there's a huge conflict of interest, okay? The people paying for them to be there, they're not going to want to enforce the law against them. And in fact, as you see with this instance, they're actually silencing the people that are critical of the event that's paying them thousands of dollars. So, it's not merely that, they just don't want to deal with it. And even if they didn't want to deal with it, they have a constitutional obligation to accommodate lawful requests to assemble. Right?
Brad, I want to bring up something. This kind of diverges from the story itself, but it's an important concept, and we can get back on things after this. But you talk about like how folks are sometimes afraid of pushing against the left because they're afraid of the repercussions. I'm going to tell you guys right now, as a conservative individual, do it. Push against the left. There are no repercussions that you should be afraid of. The left, like quite literally, when you start applying pressure, and this too, Brad, because we've talked about this, when you start applying pressure to their thoughts, their ideologies, their methodology, they break because they're just like, they think that you're just going to fall in line, because that's typically what people do, because they feel uncomfortable. Be uncomfortable. Put yourself in an uncomfortable position. You're actually going to find that you put yourself on top of the situation. Now, that being said, you guys definitely put yourselves in an uncomfortable position. So how did you go from being essentially blockaded from going to where the primary folks were at, like these transgender folks, et cetera, et cetera? How did you guys fix the issue of just being in no man's land?
Sure. And just to your point of pushing back works, in that meeting with the police, they actually let us know that our pressure on the sponsors had caused the trans queer organizers to actually cancel the drag queen story hour for kids. Okay. So it is effective because they had gone to all these small businesses in the community and said, hey, you're for, gay people having, equal rights and stuff. So give us a donation. And so people do in good faith, not realizing that this has really nothing at all to do with gays, lesbians, and bisexuals, and everything to do with pushing a trans queer agenda and including kids. I mean, they repeatedly say in their documentation, bring kids, bring your kids. We want your kids, bring your kids, And so a lot of gay people do not like what's going on there, and none of our protesting had anything to do with anyone's identity. I think that should be noted because some people were unclear about that. It's very much about the kids being there, and if the kids aren't there, those people can do whatever they like. They can rent a park and go wild, really. They can have Sodom and Gomorrah on the Coosa River if they'd like, But, to carry the narrative forward, so we were at Reverend Goggins' protest in the beginning of the day. And actually, the notorious dirty cop Dehart, who's the one that was controlling the permit process, even came up to the Reverend and said, hey, are these two with you? Meaning Angela and I, with the presumption that if he had said no, he would have arrested us at that time. Okay. So after the parade had passed, and Reverend Goggins said, yeah, they're fine. Leave them alone. After the parade had passed, we said, hey guys, we're going to go over to the outside of the park across the street. There's a bank there. We have bank accounts there. We have 24-hour ATM access. We're allowed to be there, and we know the law, okay? And the assembly ordinance, okay, it's not possible to request a permit to be on private property as an assembly because the ordinance specifically excludes private property. So if you're standing on private property holding a piece of paper with writing on it, whatever their opinion on it, they can't do anything about it under that ordinance because it has no bearing on private property, right? And we knew that because we read the ordinance. In fact, I had gone to the Public Safety Committee a month before and read off a bunch of federal cases that showed that the ordinance was totally out of whack with federal law, totally unconstitutional. And the city's attorney had gotten up and said, we had no idea we were so out of whack with federal jurisprudence and we want to get that fixed. Will you help us do that? And the notorious Officer Dehart was in that room and heard their lawyer say that their ordinance was completely out of whack and invalid. Okay, so that's another little wrinkle to keep in mind. Anyway, so we proceed over from the first protest with Goggins on the other end of downtown, where they had been placed in no man's land, over to the bank that is across the street from the event. We were there holding our signs peacefully, not interacting with anyone. There was no one to interact with on that side of the street, right? Because all the traffic was on the other side going into the park anyway. And Officer Dehart spotted us, and he spotted another group of protesters that had assembled at the edge of the bridge that comes over the river there. And we're not exactly sure who those folks are. We've been told they might be with the Catholic Church locally, but we're not sure. He gave them a 5-minute dispersal order. They left. He passes some guy in rainbow shorts with a giant fan dancing on the street, because that's perfectly okay to have that kind of an expression because he's getting paid by those people. He comes to us and gives us an illegal 5-minute dispersal order from private property. Okay. And we say to him, hey, we're on private property. Your ordinance doesn't cover private property. Okay. And, he wasn't hearing it. He said, well, the countdown is ticking. I will arrest you in 5 minutes. And I said to Angela, look, we're on firm legal footing, but I don't want to get arrested. I'm not here to get arrested today. I'm here to hold a piece of paper with writing on it. And I said, let's call our lawyer and get some solid legal advice, maybe get something in writing from him to present to the police. And so we go to the parking lot of the bank, behind the bank where we're parked. And, I call the lawyer. He's not available. So I began writing him a message. And, while I'm doing that, which, takes a while to kind of write all out, Angela walks down the sidewalk. And as I'm finishing the text message, I see her walking back toward the bank, and she had run into David and Melissa, all right, who run Greasy Boots Media, which is kind of news and politics from a working class perspective. Dave's a mechanic by trade, but he and Melissa do this Greasy Boots Media as a side business, side project, and they were there filming drone footage that day of the event and had run out of batteries, were headed back to his small business, which is in the area, to upload the footage. And so they had stopped under a shade tree across the street from the bank's property to talk about what had happened. I go over, to meet them, to talk to them, let them know what I had said to the lawyer, etc. I'd already put my signs in the trunk while I was waiting for the lawyer. So the only one holding a sign was Melissa at that point. Was Angela at that point. And Dave and Melissa, of course, were not there to protest. They never touched a sign all day. They didn't coordinate with Angela and I before that day or during that day as to where we would be. They literally just happened to run into Angela. And so we're all talking. And then we're surrounded by about 25 police officers. They can kind of spot us from the top of the levee and send in the cavalry. They gave Angela another 5-minute dispersal order. I mean, in what can she do? If she throws down the sign, she would have most certainly been charged with littering, right? They wouldn't have let that go without a citation because, they were targeting us. And she said, look, you obviously seem like you're really wanting to arrest me. Just go ahead and do it. And so the timer got to about 30 seconds. I backed up about 8 or 10 feet because that's the law in recording the police. You have to be far enough back that you're not interfering with the arrest. And David and Melissa were on the public sidewalk also filming it. So they cuff Angela and then they start toward me and they're like, oh no, you're going to jail too. And, at that point, if they've decided to arrest you, you just basically, have to go through the process. So I put my phone away. They cuffed me. They cuffed me hard enough that, I had whelps 8 hours later and my wrist is still tender to this day. They had Angela cuffed in such a way that it injured her shoulder. And to my surprise, they actually then went to Dave and Melissa and arrested them too. And it seems to be that their only crime was pissing them off by recording them. And charged them with being part of an assembly, even though they weren't. And as Dave was being carried to the car, he overheard the officers arguing because none of them wanted to sign the arrest paperwork. None of them wanted to put their badge numbers down. So they finally found one of them that was willing to do it. And they bundled us off to the jail. When we got to the jail, they were a little bemused that someone was being brought in to be booked in the jail for an ordinance. Excuse me, what? An ordinance? We were released about 3 or 4 hours later on our own recognizance. You might have seen the video we posted when we were released outside the prison. And, it's been a fight since then. So...
Brad, that is an amazing thing, man. I think the thing that gets me the most about this whole situation, it's like, okay, you guys were there with signs, et cetera, et cetera. But the thing that gets me the most is Melissa and who was it again? Melissa and who?
Melissa and Dave. They're a married couple that run Greasy Boots Media. Okay. Follow them.
Melissa and David were essentially press. They were essentially bystander.
Citizen journalists.
See, that's an amazing thing. I guess it would be one thing if they were wearing press pass, but who... They're like me, right? They do their own little local thing. They do like their occasional podcast.
And look, the federal law does not require you to have a thing that says press or to be registered anywhere. None of that.
Yeah, so that I think that's what kind of bugs me the most about this situation is you've got folks that were just standing there and were subsequently arrested, guilty by some sort of association. That's just a little much.
Right. And actually they charged Dave because he had a concealed carried firearm with a firearms offense.
Now, that's something I want to talk about too.
We need to talk about that.
Because there was a story that came out. I don't know what the story was. I forget where it came from. Maybe you can enlighten me. But in that story, right, they were talking about the arrest of, look, these individuals were arrested, this person. Oh, and this person at a gay trans event had a firearm on him. They made sure to express that this individual had a firearm on him, exercising his Second Amendment, because they want to bring that scare, Do you know who did that piece, or are you familiar with that piece?
Well, there was a piece by Rome News Tribune that essentially was the police department's damage control the next day, and it was completely factually inaccurate, and so we actually addressed that with the reporter that wrote it. I spoke to her for about an hour on the phone the other day, and they're working on some kind of a corrective piece, because in the piece they had said also that Angela was released to a probation officer, which her parents were like furious that she had not told them that she was on probation, and what has she done to be on probation, and yada yada yada. And she's like, I've never done anything. I'm not on probation. I've never been arrested in my life. What, why are they saying this about me? And I said, I don't know, but I'm going to make sure that they fix that, because I have her paperwork. It says she was released to her own recognizance, just like us, and she went out the door with Melissa. I mean, she wasn't released to a probation officer. So the whole thing, totally factually inaccurate. But I think you might be referencing the Rome News piece. And I think WSB had based a piece on their piece. So it's like a game of telephone and totally factually wrong. But, the state of Georgia has open and concealed carry laws, and state law supersedes a local ordinance every time. Not only that, it's unconstitutional because you cannot be stripped. You cannot nullify the Second Amendment just because someone is using their First Amendment rights to assembly. That's one of the major problems that render Rome's public assembly ordinance null and void.
Well, here's the thing, and here's the reason why I bring this up, Brad.
And I don't know that David even entered the park, because he was just flying drone footage. I don't know that he ever even went into the event at all.
Right.
And I might need to clarify that with him, but I don't think he did.
That would have to be, a conversation with him. But the thing that I want to point out the most, all of this is so well encompassing of how your grassroots conservative can be treated ill, right? It'll be interesting to see, what comes out in terms of like their reasoning as to why you guys were doing something wrong, But getting your story and hearing about this opens up so many cans of worms. One in particular, on a different front, is media. It's like, this is why I enjoy the long form talk between me and an individual, because we're able to like get the entire picture of something. We're able to understand something on a more fundamental level. These individuals in the media, then the way that they worded it is what irks me, because it's like, okay, I'm going to say in the same line, in the same paragraph, individual had gun, individual was watching a transgender protest. Why did you even need to say that? What is the point? What is rationally the point for you reporting on that as some kind of important thing? Was he brandishing it? Was he waving it around going, woohoo, look at my gun? No, he just had it in his pocket because this is the state of Georgia.
I mean, the man always carries. I mean, this just, he said he feels naked now that the police have his handgun in the evidence locker, because he just always has it with him. It had nothing to do particularly with where he was going. And like I said, I don't even think he went in the park that day.
Well, Brad, I want to thank you for coming in, man. I want to thank you for coming in and talking about this story, because I do think it is a good representation of some of the stuff grassroots conservatives deal with.
Sure. And I mean, this case has tons of implications for pro-life groups, for Second Amendment groups, for groups that defend the First Amendment. There's been a lot of interest behind the scenes building in this case, because it's almost as if Officer DeHart and Rome Police went down the First Amendment and checked off all of the 5 rights in there so they could violate them: freedom of religion, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, and freedom to petition the government of redress of grievances. And for a bonus, they went after the Second Amendment. So they've created almost the perfect test case for whether the Constitution still exists and is enforced in the state of Georgia.
Well, how kind of them. And I'll tell you, one of the other things that it has brought you here, and it has allowed you to take home my infamous ego on a cup.
And for the longest time, folks, I was convinced that this was a representation of Susie Voiles and her iconic glasses. But Will tells me that this is a monument to his own ego and not Susie Voiles.
A monument.
So thank you for the mug.
Yeah, man. Well, thank you for the company.
Absolutely.
I think we had a really great talk, Brad. I'll be honest with you. You've probably gotten me really addicted to this tea. Earl Grey, was it?
Yeah, you can have that box. We'll trade the box of tea for the mug.
Well, there we go. I like that trade. You know, should we? I think we should go make some more.
I think we should have some more Earl Grey tea.
Well, cheers, buddy. Good talking.
Absolutely. And thanks for bringing light on this case. If you want to find out more, Brad Barnes GA on Facebook, Twitter, all social media. And we're going to be able to do a lot more publicly now that we've had a chance to talk a little bit further with legal counsel. So follow that space for a lot more info.
Absolutely. And if you like today's content, because I know I sure did, because Brad is an awesome fellow to talk to on occasion, feel free to subscribe, like, and do all that sort of social media stuff that folks tend to do. And we will catch you guys later.